So I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I wish to thank Arindam Chakrabarti, Professor Arindam Chakrabarti, for inviting the organizers to invite me. And it's my great pleasure to meet old friends and wonderful scholars like Professor Madhumita, Chattopadhyay, and Professor Sachchidananda Mishra. And I'll read to you something short which I wrote for this occasion. Pratyakṣa in Patanjali Yoga. Patanjali opens the Yoga Sutra with a striking definition of yoga as Chitta-vritti Nirodha, or cessation of the modifications of consciousness. Subsequently, he lists a fivefold vritti scheme which the process of yoga aims at stopping or suspending. The initial component of Patanjali's scheme is pramana. The initial Chitta-vritti is pramana. In Yoga Sutra 1.7, he elucidates that it is based on Pratyakṣa, Anumana, and Agama. In Yoga Sutra 148, I'm jumping from Yoga Sutra 1.7. 1.7 says pramana is based on Pratyakṣa, Anumana, and Agama. And then in Yoga Sutra 148, Patanjali introduces the notion of Retambhara Pragya. Yogic knowledge carrying truth, or a sense of order, or harmony, Rita, developed in the course of meditation, and more precisely in the subtle meditative stage called Nirvichara Samapatti. You know that Patanjali lists, he has a list of 6 stages of meditation. Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savichara, Nirvichara. The first 2 apply to stula objects, to gross objects. The second 2, Savichara, Nirvichara, apply to sukshma, to subtle objects. And the difference between the sa and the nir is that language, apropos Arindam's talk, no longer exists in the nir vitarka, nirvichara. And then the 5th stage is meditation on an object which is so sukshma, so subtle, that it is alinga. And then the question is, what makes an alinga object still an object? But then perhaps we are talking about the alinga notion of Samkhya philosophy. Please enter and sit down. I'm repeating what I've done for the sake of this man. I started with Yoga Sutra 1.7, Patanjali starts with a list of Chitta-vrittis. One of them is pramana. Pramana is based on Pratyakṣa, Anumana, Agama. And then I'm jumping to Yoga Sutra 148, where Patanjali introduces the notion of pragya. Pragya, yogic knowledge. I'm referring to this as yogic knowledge. And Madhumita can tell us something about the Buddhist roots of the notion of pragya. Actually, Patanjali speaks about retambhara pragya, which is carrying. Sohom is here. Yeah. So this is more or less what I said so far, and then I was listing the 6 meditative stages in Patanjali. The Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savichara, Nirvichara, which I explained, and then the 5th one, which is meditation on an object which is subtle to the extent that it is alinga, and then the commentators, of course, trying to understand the notion of alinga without qualities, without linga. And then the last stage of meditation is, of course, empty meditation, Nirbija Samadhi, and the commentators. When I'm saying the commentators, I'm talking about Vyasa, Vachaspati Mishra, the Vivara Nakara, little bit Bhojraj and the Vijnana Bhikshu, the late 16th or early 17th century commentator. So with regard to Nirbija Samadhi, the commentators, starting with Vyasa, and usually the other commentators are taking his line, suggest that this is empty, not only from the Chitta-vrittis, but also from the sanskaras, even empty from the psychological substratum, if you want to call it this way. So in 148, in Yoga Sutra 148, Patanjali writes that Retambhara Pragya is essentially different from knowledge based on reliable testimony and inference, as it has particulars as its objects. Shruta Anumana Pragya Bhyam Anya Vishaya Vishesha Artatvat. I'm trying, Arindam. Reading Yoga Sutra 149 in light of Yoga Sutra 1.7, we see that something is absent here. Patanjali does not say that pragya is essentially different from or has a different object than knowledge based on pratyakṣa. By not mentioning pratyakṣa, Patanjali in fact implies that there is something pratyakshik in pragya. The classical commentators, I just mentioned their names from Vyasa to Vijnana Bhikshu, use this verse, Yoga Sutra 149, as a platform to discuss the concept of pratyakṣa, which is present in the sutra only via negativa and is not mentioned explicitly. They build a threefold pratyakṣa ladder, consisting of loka or laukika pratyakṣa, worldly, ordinary sense perception, yogi pratyakṣa, perception based on extraordinary senses, which the yogin develops. This is chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutta, and will have to renounce if he aims for kaivalya, as explained in Yoga Sutra 3:37-38. And the last stage of pratyakṣa is the last pratyakṣa, if you want, is yoga ja pratyakṣa, perception born of meditation, namely born of nirvichara samapati, or the commentators refer to it as parapratyakṣa, higher perception, namely pragya, which is not based on the senses, and reveals what? Are you following? What is the object which is revealed by this parapratyakṣa, the parapratyakṣa, which is not exactly pratyakṣa because it is not based on the senses, but there is something direct and immediate like pratyakṣa in it. So what does it reveal? What is the object of this parapratyakṣa? The commentators offer a myriad of possibilities. The miserable or pitiable shotya, human situation, which the yogin managed to climb out of, or otherwise the inner details of human consciousness, or even the particularity of each purusha, which distinguish him from other purushas, apropos the Sankhya and Purusha Bahutva framework. The commentators' discussion raises pertinent questions about the relation between pramana and prameya, the role of Ishvara in every episode of perception, the impact of the three gunas on our perception, and the categories of particulars versus universals. The list of objects. Actually, I'm coming to it in detail as I move on. I said the miserable human situation, the inner details of the human consciousness, and the distinction between the different purushas. This is Vijnana Bhikshu. This is his addition to the previous commentators. But I'm coming to it in a second. I just came to this line, Arindam. Let's get into the details. So let's get into the details. By not mentioning Pratyakṣa in Yoga Sutra 149 or through its presence in absence, Patanjali alludes to a common denominator between Pragya and Pratyakṣa. Despite their different scopes, Pratyakṣa depending on and working within the range of the senses, Pragya beyond the reach, both are of the capacity of capturing particulars. The special status of Pratyakṣa in Sutra 149, its presence in absence, enables the Sutrakara to use it as an illustration for Pragya, namely to clarify what Pragya is through sense perception as its phenomenal parallel, and simultaneously to underscore the profound difference between the two. Patanjali cannot say that Pragya and Pratyakṣa are similar, each belonging to a different consciousness mode, internal opposite external, or yogic as opposed to mundane. But he nevertheless, Patanjali allows the reader of the Yoga Sutra to feel I wrote quote unquote, to feel the quote unquote similarity between these two notions. Moreover, where am I? I lost my line. Okay, moreover, through the comparison of the two, Patanjali introduces pragya as the means of yogic knowledge, not just insight, pragya, or wisdom. I saw that our friend Pradeep Gokhale, in his book The Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, a new introduction to the Buddhist roots of the yoga system from 2020, I don't know if you saw this book, it went a little bit unnoticed because it was published in a horrible time during COVID. So Gokhale Sahab is trying to reveal the connection, Madhumita, between yoga, Patanjali's yoga and Yogacara, and we can discuss it separately. So Pradeep Gokhale translates pragya as wisdom, truth-bearing wisdom. So I'm suggesting that it is not just wisdom, it is actually not just wisdom, or and I wrote, or any other term lacking epistemological commitment, but knowledge in the full sense of the word. Pragya is yogic knowledge. This is the noetic dimension of the meditative stage at hand. In Yoga Sutra 147, Patanjali depicts the meditative setting in which Retambhara Pragya arises. I'm translating. When the meditative state called Nirvichara becomes lucid, clarity emanating from the inner self occurs. This is a very long translation of four words in Sanskrit. Nirvichara Vaisharadye Adhyatma Prasadaha. Nirvichara Vaisharadye Adhyatma Prasadaha. This is 147. According to Vyasa in his Yoga Sutra Bhashya, how did I translate Adhyatma? Inner self. Inner self, yeah. According to, I'm explaining in a second. According to Vyasa, in his commentary, the clarity prasada under discussion reveals things as they are, bhuta artha. This clarity, he suggests, resembles a clear vision from the top of a hill. From his inner, I wrote in brackets, inner, hilltop, the Bhashyakara explains the yogi who climbed up from Shochyata, from the miserable condition of worldliness, is in a position to see those who are still down there, in the Platonic cave, if you wish, as suffering. It enables to see suffering. The para Pratyakṣa shows the human suffering. This is a Vyasa. Hence, Adhyatma Prasada, clarity emanating from the inner self, is presented as an outlook from above, or the gaze of a yogin no longer involved in or determined by phenomenal or mundane experience. It is an outlook which reveals the phenomenal realm as it is, namely as full of shoka or sorrow. Vachaspati Mishra in Tattva Vaisharadi 147, his own commentary on Vyasa and the text itself, clarifies that Adhyatma Prasada does not have the self, Atman, as its object, Vishaya, but rather as its substratum or base, Adhara. Therefore, it is not clarity which reveals the self, i.e. Purusha, but clarity of which Purusha is the source. The Vivara Nakara and Vijnana Bhikshu suggest that it is clarity with regard to the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, or Purusha Prakriti Viveka, as they put it. This is to say that to see Prakriti as it is to see it as different from Purusha. Pragya then is a special type of knowledge, facilitated by the clarity emanating from Purusha. Since Purusha is always there, as the origin of awareness, a phrase which I borrow from Ian Witcher, a Yoga Sutra scholar, whether acknowledged or not, whether we acknowledge the light of Purusha or not, covered by clouds of avidya or revealed through the yogic process, the clarity of prasada originating from it is also there, available, waiting to be disclosed. Patanjali himself in Yoga Sutra 252 and 344 speaks of the process of yoga in terms of prakasha avarana kshaya, the removal of the covering of the inner light. Patanjali's commentators, I suggested in the beginning of my talk, portray Retambhara Pragya as para Pratyakṣa, or higher perception, or even perfect perception, as K.C. Bhattacharya calls it in his essay Studies in Yoga Philosophy, based on a series of lectures delivered by him at the Indian Institute of Philosophy, Amalner in 1937. Hence, since the light of Purusha is always there, I would like to suggest that Pragya is implicit in every episode of ordinary Pratyakṣa, waiting to be unveiled. So every time we perceive another perception, a deeper perception is hiding there, if we are perceptive enough, which of course we are not, to sense it. How do the commentators read Yoga Sutra 149? Vyasa opens with the attempt to explain why reliable testimony and inference cannot capture particulars. In brackets, let me say that Patanjali and his commentators do not question, as others might do, and here I'm again appealing to Madhumita, as others might do, they don't contemplate the possibility of perceiving particulars even through Pratyakṣa. Maybe Pratyakṣa cannot reveal particulars at all. So according to the commentators, only Pratyakṣa can reveal the particulars and not the universals like Anumana and Agama. The problem with reliable testimony, Vyasa suggests, is that it is based on words, Shabda. He echoes Patanjali's stand with regard to the Vikalpic nature of language. See Yoga Sutra 1.9 and 3.17, Vikalpa. Vikalpa is one of the Chittavrittis. Yes, exactly. An interesting definition of Vikalpa. This is not the Buddhist Vikalpa. It has nothing to do with the imagination. So Vikalpa, now I'm quoting T.S. Rukmani, our dear friend who passed away so recently. Vikalpa T.S. Rukmani, a wonderful yoga scholar, explains, depends on understanding the meaning of words and does not depend on the words referring to an existent object. Language, therefore, is too far from its reference, remaining always in the sphere of approximation and generality. Anumana, as per Vyasa's gloss, cannot touch on particulars because of his inbuilt indirectness. I mean, this, of course, you know, it's the same in most of the darshanas. When someone reaches somewhere, Vyasa writes, we calculate through inference the motion that has taken place. Hence, Anumana is portrayed as a second-order pramana which depends on the first-order Pratyakṣa, namely on Pratyakṣa as a mula pramana. Vyasa further argues that loka Pratyakṣa, worldly or ordinary sense perception, cannot capture subtle, sukshma, hidden, vyavahita, or distant, viprakrishta objects. He employs the exact words of Yoga Sutra 326, a sutra which discusses the activation of extraordinary senses, which can perceive such objects through yogic meditation. Yogic meditation, not to see through yogic meditation, the development of the extraordinary senses is done through meditation. Vyasa then distinguishes Pragya not just from Shruta and Anumana, but even from Loka Pratyakṣa and Yogi Pratyakṣa. Yogi Pratyakṣa is the special senses. And then I wrote in bracket, oh, let's forget my brackets. I was actually trying to think about extraordinary senses, suggesting that maybe even musicians have extraordinary, yes, even musicians with absolute pitch or skilled sommeliers, experts in wine, maybe they also have these special senses. Vyasa further engages in a debate with the Purvapakshin, the philosophical opponent, who argues that a particular Vishesha, the knowledge of which cannot be ascertained through Agama, Anumana, and Loka Pratyakṣa, does not exist. The Bhashyakara firmly answers that such a particular, whether pertaining to a subtle element or to one's own consciousness, Bhuta Sukshma Gatova, Purusha Gatova, Bhuta Sukshma Gatova, Purusha Gatova, can definitely be grasped through Pratyakṣa, which is developed through meditation. The term Purusha in the Sanskrit phrase Purusha Gatova in the present case does not refer to the Sankhya Purusha. Hariharananda Aranya, another famous early 20th century commentator of the text, in P.N. Mukherjee's translation into English, I don't remember if from Sanskrit or from Bengali, Bengali, glosses the term the Purusha-like receiver, Mahan, namely the first evolute of Prakriti, the Mahat. The inner details of the human consciousness are subtle, hidden, and remote, as much as certain objects out there in the world. Pratyakṣa developed in meditation can be outer facing, namely Yogi Pratyakṣa, and here I recall Sanjaya or Sanjay of the Gita with his Divya Drishti allotted to him by Vyasa, a different Vyasa, not this Vyasa, or inward facing, outer facing or inward facing, namely Pragya, the Yoga Sutra Pragya. But Chakrabarty Mishra adds to Vyasa's commentary that knowledge obtained through any of the conventional pramanas is inevitably infected by rajas and tamas, hence intrinsically unclear. Moreover, if Vyasa's Purva Pakshin has argued that particulars which are beyond the scope of Shruta, Anumana, and Loka Pratyakṣa are non-existent, since there is no pramana to capture them, then Chakrabarty Mishra replies that the pramana is not the cause, karana, of the prameya, the object of knowledge, in the strong sense that when the former ceases, so does the latter. He illustrates, even when the moon is just a single kala, namely 1/16 of a full moon, and the deer, harina, on the moon cannot be seen, no one doubts his existence. The illustration is interesting as it raises the fundamental question of the relation between pramana and prameya. Does a pramana reveal a quote-unquote independent object to the perceiver, or does it actually shape the object revealed? The Vivara Nakara brings a new player to the game board, Ishvara. It is a good question which I cannot delve into at present. What is the role and status of Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra? Is he Purusha or Prakriti? Purusha Vishesha, special Purusha, Patanjali answers. But what does it mean? What is Purusha Vishesha? The Purva Pakshin, written by the Vivara Nakara in Yoga Sutra Bhashya Vivarana 149, implies that if subtle elements or even one's own consciousness can be known through pragya as higher pratyakṣa, Ishvara becomes redundant or jobless, if you wish. Vijnana Bhikshu follows the commentators before him. Pratyakṣa, he maintains, is needed for perceiving subtle elements both in the world and in one's inner, both in the world and in one's inner world. Again, Bhuta Sukshma Gatova, Purusha Gatova. But for Vijnana Bhikshu, the term Purusha does not refer to one's consciousness, but to the Sankhyan Purusha. To the Sankhyan Purusha himself, I wrote, the other of Prakriti. He glosses the segment Purusha Gatova as suggesting that the quality of particularity is there in Purushas as well. T.S. Rukmani again explains that each Purusha has its own particularity. Vijnana Bhikshu thus draws on the Sankhya narrative of Purusha Bahutva. The multiplicity of Purushas, verse 18 of the Sankhya Karika suggests, is inferred from the different circumstances, birth, death, different experiences of different individuals or embodied selves here in the world. In other words, according to the Sankhyan position, if one denies difference and plurality at the Purusha level, plurality and difference at the phenomena level cannot be explained. Another explanation for the necessity of plurality at the Purusha level is found in Yoga Sutra 222. I'm translating, even though she, meaning Prakriti, ceases to exist in respect of him, a certain Purusha, for whose sake her purpose has been achieved, namely that has been enlightened, she continues to exist for others. I'm writing in brackets, namely for other Purushas still afflicted by avidya, being as she is of a common nature. In other words, the plurality of Purushas sustains the world. The unliberated as yet Purushas, despite Prakriti's effort in tune with her role in the Sankhya Karika, she is for him, right? Purushartha, for the sake of Purusha. So the other Purushas that are not enlightened need a place to be, to live, to exist, namely the world. The novelty of Vijnana Bhikshu's gloss is that according to him, alongside its function in revealing subtle elements in the world, which are beyond the scope of conventional Pratyakṣa, Pragya is of the capacity to illuminate the individuality of each Purusha. Purusha then in Vijnana Bhikshu's reading is indeed a particular, a singular universal, or a universal singular, as Gerald James Larson beautifully puts it, to be perceived by Pragya as yogic perception. Vijnana Bhikshu, following Vachaspati Mishra, continues to explain how Pragya as higher Pratyakṣa works. It removes, he explains, the tamas or unclarity inherent in a phenomenal non-yogic or pre-yogic consciousness. When tamas is dispersed, direct contact with every object, ordinary, subtle, or even the particularity of Purusha as object is established. However, this direct contact is not the sense organ and object contact, which ordinary Pratyakṣa is based on. We are back with Pratyakṣa as an illustration of Pragya. One can only speak of the latter of Pragya in terms of the former, despite the essential difference between the two, underscored by commentator after commentator. I'm coming to the last segment of my short paper. Another junction in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is relevant for our discussion, is Patanjali's debate with an implied Buddhist opponent in chapter 4 of his treatise, Yoga Sutra 4:19 to 21. The bone of contention here is the necessity, or not, of postulating an essentialist selfhood such as Patanjali's Sankhya Purusha. Patanjali argues in these verses that the consciousness, chitta, cannot perceive both an object and itself simultaneously. Therefore, it perceives objects and itself is perceived by Purusha. The metaphysical I called Purusha, I, or the metaphysical I, if you wish, this I, the I that sees. The implied Buddhist opponent, implied because we don't read the Buddhist opponent, we read only Patanjali's answers. The implied Buddhist opponent counter-argues, or so we deduce from Patanjali's answers, that Patanjali's postulation is unnecessarily uneconomic. Instead, it would be more economic, philosophically speaking, to infer that the consciousness is perceived by another consciousness, or even other consciousnesses in the plural. In such a case, Purusha as a meta-perceiver becomes redundant. This is the implied Buddhist Purva Pakshim. Patanjali's response is that the opponents move implying a network of consciousnesses perceiving one another. This is a complicated one, but if you want I can say something more about it. Implying a network of consciousnesses perceiving one another is unacceptable, Patanjali says, because it leads to infinite regress, ati prasanga. I.e., if one consciousness perceives another, we must postulate a third consciousness to perceive the second, a fourth to perceive the third, and so on. And this is interesting, why ati prasanga is such a terrible fallacy. And moreover, it leads, if we postulate one consciousness, second consciousness, etc., etc., and moreover, to intermixture of memories, smriti sankara. And this connects to the talk of the Vice Chancellor in the morning. Intermixture of memories. I cannot even make a first step into the question of memory in Patanjali Yoga. Actually, there's a three-layer memory. Regular, ordinary memory, if you want to call it, I don't know, deep memory, sanskaras and vasanas, and then the memory of Purusha, which is a Platonic-like memory of our, I don't know, inner self, true self. So I just said that I cannot even start to delve, but I said something about memory in the Yoga Sutta. It's interesting and of course more complex than what I just presented. Vyasa opens his commentary on memory by raising this pertinent question: does the mind, chitta, remember the presentation, pratyaya, of an object? Or, as Patanjali implies, the object's vishaya itself? This would be a first step of discussing memory. I cannot make the second step and the following steps. The point for our sake is that our perception, The point for our perception's sake is that the mind perceives objects and is perceived by Purusha. But these are two different types of perception, right? Vyasa dedicates his gloss of Yoga Sutra 220, which I'm translating quickly. The seer, drashtre, is nothing but pure seeing, drishi. Although pure, namely contentless, he sees mental activity. Pratyaya anupashyaha. So Vyasa dedicates his gloss to the similarity and difference in the perception of the mind, the buddhi, by Purusha, and the perception of the objects by the mind. The mind perceives object, he writes, as long as they come in touch with it, through the senses, or color it. In the same way, but altogether differently, the buddhi is perceived by Purusha. In the same way as Vyasa puts it in his present gloss, and Vachaspati Mishra in his commentary on Yoga Sutra 1.7, since Purusha is the introspector of the buddhi. Buddhehe prati samvedi Purusha. So this is the interesting notion here, prati samvedi. The verb prati samvedi conveys the link between Purusha and the buddhi. Owing to his, Purusha's unchanging presence, the ever-changing buddhi is seen. Moreover, in the light emanating from him, from Purusha again, the buddhi is not just seen, but also perceives objects. When his light is reflected in the buddhi, the light assumes the latter's shape, just as the buddhi itself assumes the form of the objects perceived by it. The buddhi is hence depicted as a prism through which the light of Purusha is refracted and transforms into a chittavriti. Similar as Purusha's perception is to the perception of objects by the mind, Vyasa also underscores the difference between these two perception types. The buddhi as Purusha's object, he suggests, is not perceived or not perceived, grehita agrehita, as the objects of the mind are by the mind, but is rather constantly perceived, the light of Purusha being ever illuminating. Vyasa in his gloss of Yoga Sutra 220 cannot but speak of Purusha in terms of the buddhi. Perception is a function of the buddhi or the mind. This was the end of my talk. Perception is the function of the buddhi. He speaks of Purusha in terms of the buddhi. We cannot but speak of the metaphysical in terms of the physical. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
So many thanks for your enlightening scholarly talk on perception in the yoga. I'll act as the devil's advocate here. So you acknowledge yoga's Pratyakṣa as not being sensory and yet being a legit case of perception. Just precisely in the sense that even Buddha-Ghosha, one of my proponents that I speak of, understands extrasensory visual perception in precisely the same way as arising from Divya Chakshu and not just Chakshu. But acting as the devil's advocate, akin to Kumarila, one of my other proponents, I ask, what is it that makes Yogaja Pratyakṣa not born of the senses, sense perception itself, for, as you mentioned, quote unquote, immediacy of resultant cognition, as stated by you, does not serve as a sufficient enough condition for the devil here itself. For something akin to the senses remaining and retaining connection with objects to yield perception is sufficient enough for the devil to qualify as perception. But that in this case of Yoga's Pratyakṣa for yoga and as well as Buddha Kosha is thrown out of the window, as such perception is exclusive of sense involvement at all. So perhaps if you would like to say something about it.
This was interesting and plenty of devils were there. So what's the bottom line? What's the question? In what sense meditation? I mean the Pratyakṣa which is born of meditation is at all Pratyakṣa? This is what you're asking?
I'm just saying that the sufficient condition you mentioned, it's not sense-born, yet it is immediate, therefore it is Pratyakṣa. But that's not a sufficient enough condition. Would you like to offer another sufficient enough condition?
Basically, what I was repeating again and again is that we are trying to use language to describe very subtle meditative experience, which is either impossible or almost impossible, but needed for the sake of pedagogical yogic progress. So what I was suggesting is that we are using a day-to-day language like Pratyakṣa in order to capture or to point at what I refer to as the noetic dimension of meditation. But then it's also interesting to notice that Patanjali is very focused on meditation, whereas his commentators are, at least in my impression, are more interested in philosophy than in meditation, and they take the Patanjali's verses which refer to Nirvichara Samapati as an occasion, as an opportunity to discuss the whole question of Pratyakṣa, from the ordinary Pratyakṣa to the highest, the perfect Pratyakṣa, as K.C. Bhattacharya refers to it. And then basically I was summarizing for you the commentators. This was the main thing that I was doing here, but I wanted to also to suggest something, to bring something more to the table. And then I suggested that maybe in every episode of Pratyakṣa, of ordinary Pratyakṣa, seeing you as the devil's attorney standing just next to me, maybe there is a Samadhi Ja Pratyakṣa which is waiting here somewhere around me, which can be disclosed through the act of perception.
Right.
But what you said about, basically you imply that there is a very strong connection between Buddhism and Patanjali, which of course I agree. We can see from
no, that's not the ramification of my comment, sir. The ramification of my comment only is that Kumarila relegates, does not regard Yogaj Pratyakṣa of Dharmakirti, of Buddha Ghosha as Pratyakṣa at all, because he says the sufficient enough condition for Pratyaksh to be Pratyaksh is the Sat Samprayoga, connection with the present.
So this I understood. So then the commentators use the notion of Pratyakṣa as some kind of a metaphor, in order to refer to this subtle meditative state.
Precisely, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this learned question.
Any other question?
I see your point, which doesn't mean that. Yes, I see. Like we say, I see, which is not literal.
That's the only thing that you wanted to say. Say something more.
No.
I brought you the mic to say something.
Can I say something? It's a very ordinary one. At the beginning, you told that the pramana is based on Pratyakṣa, perception, inference, and testimony.
Agama, and later it was Shruta.
Yes, but my question is, are they, is the yoga system making a distinction between pramana and prama? Because when you say is based on, means that these are the coroners. Whereas pramana then would mean knowledge. So on the basis of perception, inference, and agama, which you translate as scriptures or anything, we have some knowledge, and that is. So here we find that the yoga system is following the Nyaya tradition of making the distinction between pramana and prama. So that is my question.
So I'm leaving your question open. It's a good question. And the question is, when Patanjali says that yoga is the stoppage of the chitta vrittis, the first one is pramana. Maybe you can think, how do we understand pramana? we understand pramana as knowledge, as right knowledge,
No.
or do we understand pramana as means of knowledge?
Actually, in narrow system, it is understood as the means of right knowledge or valid knowledge.
Yeah.
But in Buddhism, the pramana is knowledge itself.
Yeah, so I think that also in Patanjali it would be right knowledge. Sir.
Identified here. Yes.
This is, I find, very complicated. Complicated in the sense that yoga is defined yogas chittavritti nirodha. And in 5 chittavrittis there is one pramana vritti. And you are talking about yogaja pratyaksha. So it is a great contradiction, doesn't appear? Because it is said that yoga is chittavritti nirodha. Yoga is chittavritti nirodha. So if all the chittavrittis are stopped, how there is a possibility of perception? And how it will be? Yogaja pratyaksha, how yogaja pratyaksha will be possible?
So actually Vyasa, in his commentary on Yoga Sutra, the second verse says Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha. The first verse says Ata Yoganu Shasanam. It's like the title of the text. So Vyasa, the Bhashyakara, in his commentary to Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha, says the word sarva does not occur in this verse. It doesn't say yoga is the cessation of all the activity of consciousness. Sarva does not occur in this verse. And now, because you are such a close reader of texts, Sachchidananda, you understand that when Vyasa says the word sarva does not occur here, he means it occurs somewhere else. And of course, it occurs in the last verse of chapter 1. In the last verse of chapter 1, when Patanjali speaks about Nirbija Samadhi, then suddenly the word sarva occurs. So actually, the process of yoga, you know that the Bhagavad Gita, how do I jump to the Bhagavad Gita? The Bhagavad Gita was first translated into Hebrew in 1956 by a wonderful scholar. And when the word yoga occurs in the Bhagavad Gita, he translates the word into Hebrew. Why does he translate the word yoga? Nowadays, no one would think of translating the word yoga, right? It's an international word. Everyone knows what yoga is. But in 1956, of course, in Israel, when the text was translated, no one had a clue what yoga is. And then he translated the word yoga as pressing the how do you say it in English? Pressing the brake, like in a car. You were giving all the examples of the missing car. So now we have a missing brake. You press the brake. Now, my friend here doesn't drive, but you drive. So as a driver, you know that when you press the brake, it takes a while until the car stops. How would you take this as an answer to your question? In verse 2, Patanjali is pressing the brake. In verse 151, the missing car from the Vice Chancellor stops. So, of course, the whole business of talking about yoga will stop in 190 something verses. So this is my answer to you. So it's not a contradiction in terms. It's like this is another example from a context. Yeah. Is pragya a chitta vritti? The answer is, this is like asking if Ishvara is Purusha or Prakriti. It's a Vishesha, it's a Chitta Vritti Vishesha, it's a special Chitta Vritti. And I'll tell you why. Because even Pragya has to be dispersed as you go on in the process of yoga. The whole discussion, as implied by Sachchidananda, Patanjali says everything has to be stopped, but then you ask what? And then he's giving you a very elaborate map of everything that has to be. It's like deleting something if you want from a computer. So tell me which items have to be deleted. But even now my illustration is problematic because when you delete something, it can be restored. And now the question is about the Chittavrittis. And then the commentators talk about it. Are they just dormant? Are they permanently distinguished, etc., etc.? Finally.
No, I really think that this discussion was crucial, very crucial, because many of us here have been spending our lives on these texts, including you. But this is a contradiction which has never been so properly, clearly articulated. But then the answer actually makes me reflect on the entire course of the, the Samadhi Pada, Sadhana Pada, Vibhuti Pada and Kaivalya Pada, all of them, until the end of Kaivalya Pada. And I think we have solved a problem. The problem was, it seemed, Sarva Chitta Vritti Nirodha, all the modifications of the mind. And you ended your paper by saying that prajna, perception, even yogaja perception, is a function of buddhi. If all of them have to be completely nirodha samadhi, then to say that prajna and all will come when you have attained samadhi is like saying that you will have the best bowel movements when you are completely constipated. And it doesn't make sense because you have stopped everything. But the answer you gave, I think, is very revealing, because indeed prajna perhaps will also go. Even Ritambara
Not
prajna.
only pragya will grow, even the sanskara which is created by pragya, even this will grow.
And
And this is the most quote unquote positive way.
And this is why the Kaivalya, the yogic liberated person, is not trying to become God. Because in God, Tatra Niratisham Sarvajna Bijam, God is omniscient. He is stuck with his maximum knowledge. But the last but one verse, Sutra of Kaivalya Pada says, Prasankhya, which is the final samadhi. Prasankhya is nirbija and everything. Prasankhya api akusidasya. Somebody who is not interested even in prasankhya will be liberated. So that will be not a yogaja perception. It is all chittavritti is gone.
Yeah.
And that is liberated. No buddhi left. Only purushamat.
And this is really now the last temptation of the yogi. This would be the last temptation of the yogi, to give up even knowledge itself, which was acquired through such hard effort. You wrote about it, the notion of vairagya, para vairagya.